The dust-choked air of Camp Saad, a sprawling coalition forward operating base carved into the barren rock of northern Iraq, tasted of grit and aviation fuel. For specialist Lena Kozlov, that taste was the familiar, unremarkable flavor of home. While the base hummed with the kinetic energy of Special Operations Forces, the quiet intensity of Delta operators, the boisterous camaraderie of Rangers, and the focused silence of the Navy SEALs from Echo Platoon, Lena's world was the hangar. It was a cavernous space of corrugated iron and hydraulic lifts, smelling of oil, sweat, and burnt metal. To the warriors who flew in the MH-60M Blackhawks she maintained, she was simply Kaz, the phantom who haunted the night shift, ensuring their chariots were flawless for the next day's descent into hell. She was a wisp of a woman, dwarfed by the massive helicopters she serviced. Her frame was deceptively slight, but her hands, permanently stained with grease and cross-hatched with tiny scars, possessed a strength and precision born of a childhood spent rebuilding Soviet-era farm equipment with her grandfather in a small Ukrainian village. That life felt like a distant, sepia-toned dream now. America, the Army, and this dusty base were her reality. She was an anomaly, a female mechanic in a world of male operators, and she preferred the quiet company of her tools to the boisterous atmosphere of the mess hall. She knew every bolt, every wire, every quirk of the two Black Hawks she was responsible for, call signs Viper 1 and Viper 2. She could diagnose a faulty fuel pump by its whine and predict a rotor blade issue from the subtlest vibration. The helicopters, to her, were living things, and she was their surgeon. Her path rarely crossed with the men who flew them. They'd roar in from a mission, hyped on adrenaline, and hand the birds over to her team. To them, she was a faceless part of the support crew, as invisible as the cooks or the fuel truck drivers. Their world was one of direct action, of high-stakes raids and close-quarters combat. Hers was one of torque wrenches and diagnostic software. They'd pat the fuselage of the helicopter, thanking the machine, not the woman who had spent the night coaxing it back to life. And Lena preferred it that way. She'd watch them from the shadows of the hangar, these modern-day knights, their faces painted for war, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. She felt no envy, only a quiet sense of purpose. And she kept them alive in her own way, ensuring the steed was always ready. The SEALs of Echo Platoon were a breed apart, even among the elite. Led by the unflappable Senior Chief Marcus Thorne, they were a tight-knit brotherhood of lethal professionals. Lena knew them only by their call signs, overheard in the hangar. Thorne, the stoic leader. Gunny Hastings, the hulking, cynical senior enlisted. Ace, the young, cocky pilot. Preach, the quiet, introspective sniper. They were a unit, a single efficient organism. They'd stride past her with a curt nod, their gear clanking, their presence filling the space with an unspoken authority. They never saw her. To them, she was just another mechanic in a baggy flight suit, another cog in the vast military machine that enabled their missions. That night, the air was thick with tension, but an Army Ranger patrol had been ambushed near the Syrian border, pinned down in a maze of ancient wadis. Echo Platoon was the QRF, the Quick Reaction Force. The hangar erupted into controlled chaos as the pilots and crew chiefs rushed to Viper 1 and 2 for pre-flight. Lena was already there, having just finished a routine fluid analysis on Viper 1's main transmission. She stepped back into the shadows as the men swarmed the aircraft, their voices clipped and urgent. Senior Chief Thorne paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the rotor hub, the very component Lena had just been scrutinizing. He seemed to sense her presence and gave a barely perceptible nod in her direction. It was the first time he had ever truly acknowledged her. She returned it, a silent affirmation. She's good to go. Within minutes, the rotors were a blur, and the two Black Hawks lifted off into the moonless sky, their navigation lights blinking like distant, fading stars. Lena watched them go, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She shook it off, grabbed a wrench, and turned her attention to the next piece of machinery demanding her focus. The war would continue here in the hangar, under the harsh fluorescent lights. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the frantic, broken radio traffic that crackled through the command post an hour later. Words like massive enemy force, unable to extract, and taking heavy fire painted a horrifying picture. The rescue mission had turned into a trap. The Wadis, it turned out, were a honeypot, swarming with a far larger and better organized insurgent force than intelligence had suggested. Both Black Hawks had been hit during the landing. Viper 2 was a burning wreck. Viper 1 was down but seemingly intact, its rotors still, its crew and the SEALs now fighting for their lives in a desperate, sprawling firefight. The base comms became a torrent of panicked voices. The initial elation of the QRF being launched was replaced by a chilling dread. The commander, a harried colonel, was on the satellite phone, screaming for air support that was either too far away or already committed elsewhere. The situation was a complete catastrophe. In the hangar, Lena and the other mechanics had gathered around a small, tinny radio, listening in horror. The man they called Gunny, usually so stoic, was on the net, his voice ragged with exertion and pain, calmly relaying their dire situation. They were pinned in a shallow depression, low on ammunition with multiple casualties. They were estimating the enemy force at over 100, and they were methodically closing in. The final chilling message from Senior Chief Thorne was relayed. They were preparing to fight to the last man. They were signing off. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the hangar. The mechanics looked at each other, their faces pale. There was nothing they could do. They were support, not combat troops. They fixed helicopters. They didn't fly them into the heart of a firestorm. The colonel's voice could be heard from the CP, a desperate litany of failed options. Then, a quiet voice cut through the hangar's silence. Viper 1's auxiliary power unit is still online. It was Lena. Everyone stared at her. She was looking not at the radio, but at the maintenance logs on her tablet. The telemetry data dump from just before they went down. The APU is functional. The main engines are probably slagged from small arms fire, but the electrical system is intact. She's not a dead bird. She's just asleep. Her crew chief, a burly sergeant named Kowalski, just shook his head. Forget it, Kaz. Even if she could turn over, there's no pilot. Ace is on the ground with his team. And even if there was, you'd need a death wish to fly into that. Lena looked from the tablet to the empty space on the flight line where Viper 1 should have been. She thought of Thorne's nod. She thought of the 18 men, the ones who never saw her, the ones who were about to die. She thought of her grandfather, who had taught her that a machine was never truly broken until you gave up on it. I can fly, she said, her voice soft but clear. I have a private pilot's license. Fixed wing. But a helicopter. The principles are the same, and I know that helicopter better than anyone alive. I know every sound she makes, every shudder, every quirk. I can get her in the air. I can get her there. The hangar erupted in a chaotic mix of disbelief and arguments, but Lena was already moving, pulling up the engine startup procedure on her tablet. She walked past them, out into the night, towards the solitary shape of the damaged Black Hawk. Kowalski ran after her, his voice a desperate plea. You'll be shot down before you cross the perimeter. You're a mechanic, Kozlov, not a goddamn pilot. Lena stopped and turned to face him. In the dim light, her grease-stained face was a mask of serene, unshakable resolve. So I'm the only chance they've got. She climbed into the pilot's seat of Viper 1, the familiar smell of Avgas and hydraulic fluid enveloping her. The cockpit was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the standby instruments. She ran her hand over the collective and cyclic, the controls she had only ever touched during ground run-ups. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum beat against the silence. She flipped the battery master switch. The cockpit lights flickered on, a hesitant, artificial dawn. She pressed the APU start button. A low whine began to build behind her, the sound of the auxiliary power unit spinning up, a sound of life in the metal beast. The radio crackled. It was the colonel's voice, a mix of fury and desperate hope. "Who the hell is in that helicopter? Identify yourself!" Lena took a deep breath, in the air thick with the scent of her own fear. She keyed the mic. "Sir, this is Specialist Kozlov. I'm taking Viper 1 to get our guys." The rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then with a growing, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that vibrated through the entire airframe. The control tower was screaming at her to stop, the colonel's voice a torrent of frantic orders. Lena ignored them all. Her world narrowed to the instrument panel in front of her. She had seen Ace start the engines 100 times. Muscle memory, born of countless hours of observation and ground maintenance, took over. She advanced the throttle for the number 1 engine. The turbine spooled up with a familiar screaming whine. Then the second. The rotor disc overhead became a solid blur, of the helicopter shuddering and straining against the brakes like a racehorse at the gate. The vibrations were wrong, harsher than they should be. The main rotor was out of track from the ground fire. It would affect performance, make it harder to control, but it would fly. Lena released the parking brake, and Viper 1 lifted awkwardly into the night sky, a wounded bird taking flight against all odds. Below her, the base shrank to a constellation of lights, a world of order and protocol she was leaving behind. Ahead, a wall of absolute blackness marked the jagged horizon. Somewhere in that darkness, 18 men were fighting for their last breaths. Lena gripped the cyclic, her knuckles white, and flew towards the sound of guns. The flight was a terrifying ordeal. The Black Hawk, damaged and out of trim, fought her every inch of the way. It yawed left constantly, forcing her to apply constant right pedal. The vibrations were so violent they rattled her teeth and blurred her vision. She was flying nap of the earth, skimming the rocky ground at over 100 knots, using the terrain to mask her approach from enemy radar. The navigation system was partially fried, so she relied on the faint flashing strobe of the tracer fire on the horizon as her beacon. It looked like a malevolent fireworks display, a constant stream of red and green streaks arcing through the dark. She flew towards hell. As she got closer, the scene unfolded below her in stark, terrifying clarity. The SEALs and the downed Ranger Patrol were in a shallow, bowl-shaped depression, their position marked by a tight perimeter of muzzle flashes. Around them, the night was alive with enemy fire. And they were completely surrounded, the attackers moving with the confidence of a force that knew it had won. Lena could see the enemy fighters swarming over the rocky slopes, firing down into the position. It was a killing ground. Her radio crackled with Thorne's voice, disbelief cutting through the exhaustion. "Viper 1, this is Echo Actual. Identify yourself." Lena's voice was calm as she responded, a strange serenity settling over her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was pushed aside by a laser-like focus. "Echo Actual, this is Kozlov. I'm your ride. Sit tight." There was a long pause on the radio. Then Gunny's gruff voice came through, tinged with a dark, incredulous laughter. "Holy shit, it's the Phantom Mechanic." Lena couldn't land in the middle of a firefight. But she'd be shredded the moment she touched down. She had to give them a chance. She spotted a slight rise just outside the enemy's main concentration, a finger of rock that provided a modicum of cover from the west. It was a desperate, crazy plan. She banked the helicopter hard, the protesting whine of the damaged transmission filling the cabin. She lined up for a high-speed, low-level pass directly over the SEAL's position, her landing lights blazing. The sudden, thunderous appearance of a Black Hawk, its lights on, roaring just 50 feet overhead, had the desired effect. Dozens of insurgents, focused on the ground assault, spun around in shock, their rifles tracking the massive, noisy bird. For a precious few seconds, their fire was diverted from the men in the wadi. It was the opening Thorne needed. "Now! Move! Move! I'll move!" he roared over the net. The SEALs and Rangers, dragging their wounded, broke cover and sprinted for the slight rise Lena had indicated. Lena pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing her into her seat, and bled off her speed in a gut-wrenching turn. She flared the helicopter, bringing it to a hover just above the rocky outcrop. The landing skids touched down with a jarring crunch. The ramp was still dropping when the first of the men scrambled aboard, their faces masks of caked-on dust and exhaustion. They were hauling their wounded, laying them on the deck with a desperate urgency. Gunny was the last one on, laying down a furious burst of covering fire. "We're all aboard, Kaz! Go, go, go!" he screamed. But as Lena pulled collective to lift off, a new sound tore through the night, the sharp, a distinctive crack of a rocket-propelled grenade launching. It slammed into the helicopter's tail boom with a deafening explosion. The aircraft lurched violently, yawing sharply to the right. The control pedals went slack. The tail rotor, which provided anti-torque control, was gone. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree. The helicopter began to spin, an uncontrollable, sickening rotation. They were going to crash. In the back, men were thrown against the bulkheads. Lena fought the controls, her body screaming, but there was nothing she could do. The ground rushed up to meet them. The world became a twisting vortex of noise, light, and crushing, bone-jarring impact. Then silence, a thick, choking silence, broken only by the hiss of escaping fluids and the crackle of fire. Viper 1 had made its last landing. The crash threw Lena hard against her harness, the impact driving the breath from her lungs. For a moment, the world was a fog of pain and disorientation. The cockpit was canted at a crazy angle, the windscreen a spiderweb of cracks. The acrid smell of smoke and hydraulic fluid burned her nose. She blinked, trying to focus. The spinning had stopped. They were down. They were alive. But for how long? The enemy would be on them in minutes. She could hear shouts and groans from the cabin behind her. She fumbled with her harness release, her fingers thick and clumsy. She finally got it undone and half fell, half climbed out of the pilot's seat and into the main cabin. The scene inside was one of organized chaos. The cabin was dark, lit only by the flickering orange glow of a small fire near the damaged tail section. Men were moving with practiced efficiency, treating wounds, checking weapons. The stench of blood, burnt wiring, and propellant was overwhelming. Gunny Hastings was already on his feet, his face a mask of blood from a gash on his forehead, calmly directing the men. He saw Lena stumble out of the cockpit, her flight suit torn, her eyes wide. "Kozlov, you okay?" he barked. She just nodded, unable to speak. He gave her a grim, approving look. "Hell of a landing. Any landing you can walk away from, right?" He turned and shouted, "All right, listen up. We've got company coming. Form a perimeter. Preach, find us a fallback position. Doc, get the wounded stable." The SEALs and Rangers moved like a well-oiled machine, snapping into action despite their exhaustion and injuries. They dragged the most severely wounded to the relative cover of the wrecked helicopter's fuselage. Others took up positions behind rocks and chunks of twisted metal, their weapons pointed out into the darkness. The volume of enemy fire was already intensifying. They knew the helicopter was down. They knew the infidels were trapped. This was their moment. Lena stood frozen for a moment, a mechanic in a world of warriors. She had no weapon, no training for this. She was utterly useless. A wave of helplessness washed over her, followed by a surge of defiant anger. She hadn't flown through hell just to be a sitting duck. She looked around the wreckage of her helicopter. It was a treasure trove. Her mind, trained to see the utility in every component, began to race. She saw the thick armor plating of the crew seats. She saw the hardened steel of the main rotor blades, snapped and lying on the ground nearby. She saw the Dan Yao cans, designed to be jettisoned. She saw the wiring, the hydraulics, the fuel. "Gunny!" she shouted, finding her voice. Hastings turned, a question in his eyes. What? I can make this place a fortress, she said, her voice gaining strength. Give me 5 minutes and some tools. He looked from her to the approaching enemy, then back at the wreckage. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his bloodied face. Get to work, Kaz. We'll hold them off. For the next few hours, Lena Kozlov ceased to be a mechanic and became an engineer of survival. Under the constant crackle of small arms fire, with bullets pinging off the wreckage around her, she worked with a desperate, furious energy. She directed 2 of the less injured SEALs, showing them how to unbolt the heavy armored seat panels. They dragged them to the perimeter, creating instant, bulletproof fighting positions. She used the helicopter's fire axe to chop away sections of the damaged rotor blades, handing the super-strong composite material to the men to use as overhead cover. She found the survival kit and distributed the flares, showing them how to use them not just for signaling, but as incendiary devices. She jury-rigged the helicopter's battery to the landing lights, creating a blinding spotlight that she could switch on to dazzle any attackers attempting a rush. But her masterpiece was yet to come. The GAU-17/A minigun mounted in the helicopter's door was still operational. Its electrical firing mechanism was fried, but the 6-barreled Gatling-style gun itself was a marvel of engineering. She had helped the crew chiefs reload it 100 times. She knew its mechanics intimately. She crawled under the fuselage, into the sparks and dripping fluids, and with a pair of wire cutters and a wrench, she began to bypass the electrical firing system. She hot-wired it directly to the helicopter's remaining battery power and jury-rigged a simple push-button trigger from the intercom system. It was crude, dangerous, and would probably overheat after a few seconds, but it would fire. When she dragged the heavy weapon to the perimeter and showed Gunny what she had done, the big man just stared at her. "You're not a mechanic, Kozlov," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You're a goddamn magician." As the first wave of the enemy assault crested the hill, Gunny and another SEAL opened up with the jury-rigged minigun. The devastating high-pitched roar of the weapon cut through the night, a sound of pure mechanical fury. The sheer volume of lead it spewed tore into the attacking force, shredding their momentum and sending them scrambling for cover. Lena watched from behind a chunk of the helicopter's skin, her heart soaring. The machine she had loved and cared for was now fighting back. The mechanic had given it teeth. The night stretched into an endless, brutal marathon. The enemy, shocked by the sudden and violent resistance from the crashed helicopter, regrouped and came again. And again. Each attack was met by a fierce, coordinated defense. The SEALs and Rangers, though battered and outnumbered, that were apex predators. They used the wreckage Lena had provided as a perfect defensive bastion. The armored plates stopped rifle rounds that would have found flesh. The rotor blade shields protected them from shrapnel, and the minigun, which they used in short, devastating bursts to keep it from melting, was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Its mere presence forced the attackers to be cautious, to flank wide, buying precious time. Lena wasn't on the firing line. She was in the makeshift aid station, a relatively sheltered spot behind the helicopter's engine cowling. She had been drawn there by the desperate cries of the wounded. The platoon's medic, Doc Williams, was a young man with gentle hands and a haunted expression. He was overwhelmed, trying to treat 4 critical patients simultaneously. He had run out of bandages, some morphine, and ideas. Lena appeared beside him. "Tell me what to do." It wasn't a question. For the rest of the night, she became his hands. He would instruct, she would execute. She learned to apply tourniquets with the same precision she used to torque a bolt. She held pressure on wounds, her hands slick with blood. She cut away clothing, prepared saline drips, and held flashlights so Doc could dig for shrapnel. She witnessed the raw, brutal reality of combat medicine. The quiet courage of men fighting through agony, the soft words of comfort to the dying, the grim determination to save just one more. During a lull, Senior Chief Thorne came to check on the wounded. He looked haggard. His eyes sunk deep in their sockets, but his presence was as steady as a rock. He saw Lena, her flight suit now more red than green, and her face smeared with blood and grime, carefully holding a pressure bandage on a young ranger's shattered leg. Their eyes met. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The look that passed between them was an acknowledgement of something far deeper, a shared burden, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of survival. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound appreciation, and moved on back to the fight. For Lena, that nod from their leader meant more than any medal ever could. The final assault came with the first hint of gray in the eastern sky. The enemy, knowing that coalition aircraft would soon be able to fly, threw everything they had at the wreck. It was a desperate, suicidal wave. The firing was continuous, a deafening roar. The SEALs were down to their last magazines. The minigun had finally seized up, its barrels glowing red. Gunny was wounded again, a bullet creasing his side. Preach, the sniper, was calmly picking off targets with his pistol. Thorne was moving along the line, encouraging, directing fire, a living legend of coolness under fire. It looked like the end. The wave of fighters was just meters away, their faces clear in the dawn light. Then a new sound tore through the air, the deep, throaty roar of jet engines. 2 A-10 Warthogs, the ugly, beautiful tank killers of the Air Force, screamed over the ridge at treetop height. Their 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannons opened up, and the sound was unlike anything else on Earth, a prolonged, ripping growl like the sky itself was tearing apart. The effect on the massed enemy troops was instantaneous and catastrophic. The cannon fire plowed through their ranks, turning their assault into a rout. Following close behind were 2 MH-60M Blackhawks, their doors crammed with more SEALs from a sister platoon. The cavalry had finally arrived. The relief force swept in, securing the perimeter and evacuating the wounded. As the first rays of the sun crested the hills, Lena found herself sitting on a rock, shivering despite the growing warmth, staring at the wreck of Viper 1. It was a burned, twisted skeleton, a monument to the night's horrors. She felt utterly empty. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion and a mind reeling from the images it had been forced to record. A shadow fell over her. She looked up. Senior Chief Thorne, Gunny, Preach, and several other SEALs were standing there. They were a mess, bandaged, dirty, hollow-eyed, but they were alive. Thorne extended a hand and pulled her to her feet. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Gunny broke the silence. "Kozlov," he said, his voice raspy, "if you ever get tired of turning wrenches, I know a few guys who'd go to war with you any time." It was the highest compliment a SEAL could give. Lena looked at them, these men she had watched from the shadows for months. She saw them now, not as untouchable knights, but as men, brothers. And in their eyes, she saw herself reflected not as a phantom, but as one of them, a warrior. She hadn't fired the shot that killed 50 enemies. She had done something far more difficult. She had refused to let them die. She had taken a machine she loved and turned it into an instrument of salvation. She looked back at the smoldering wreck, then at the living, breathing men in front of her. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "I was just doing my job," she said. For the first time, it was the absolute truth. Her job was no longer just about keeping helicopters flying. It was about keeping the men inside them alive, and she had done it. The Phantom Mechanic had become their guardian angel, forged in grease, steel, and an unbreakable will.